This lighting is giving spooky, it's giving Halloween, it is unintentional, but it's giving vampire. Hi, welcome back to my channel. My name is Kayla. I like to talk about books, book reviews, some reading vlogs, kind of like some random tidbits thrown in, but mostly things like that. Today I'm just going to be doing a straightforward book review on a new release called The Leftover Woman by Jean Kwok. So this book really just came out this past week and I went through it really quickly. Like, obviously I'm going to get into my thoughts, but overall I thought it was pretty enjoyable. If this is as far as you watch, I'd recommend it to most people, but I'm going to do this like I do all of my little book reviews, and I'm going to start with kind of a synopsis summary and then I'm going to get right into my review. The synopsis will be short this time. It will be just that, a synopsis, nothing crazy, because I don't want to give a ton of spoilers in this review, and I think I can adequately give my thoughts on this book in particular without giving a ton of spoilers. It's possible that I will talk a little bit about the ending, and if that's true, I will give a huge spoiler alert before that happens. But I think most of my notes on this are actually vague enough that they won't spoil it, so you can proceed if you haven't read it yet. So, the synopsis. This story follows two women, Jasmine, a woman from China who escaped an abusive arranged marriage that was arranged when she was really young, and Rebecca, who is mother to a young girl in New York. And Rebecca comes from a pretty wealthy family. She has her daughter is adopted, and she is also a working mother. She works a pretty demanding job that she's very into. What brings them and their stories together, you may ask? Rebecca's adopted daughter is actually Jasmine's daughter, and Jasmine is in New York trying to track down said daughter. And so that's kind of how these two stories of these two women intertwine and connect, and it takes a little while, but yeah, it's pretty interesting. The backstory basically is that Jasmine's husband told her she had lost her baby shortly after she gave birth, and she was really young and had some like miscarriages and fertility issues anyway, so losing her baby shortly after birth didn't seem like that crazy. I don't even think she really questioned it. But the baby wasn't lost. Her husband actually put the baby up for adoption without her knowledge or consent. And honestly, this part of the story, this is not giving anything away. This is pretty early in the book. This is just baseline knowledge of the story. But just that premise alone to me is so heartbreaking, because I cannot imagine giving birth to my baby, going through all of that, especially after multiple losses, and then thinking I lost my baby, but somebody taking my... Like, that's just, to me, one of the most horrific things I can imagine in this life. Maybe it's because I'm still within a year postpartum, but that just feels like one of the most horrific things I can imagine. And so Jasmine finds out years later that her husband did this, and there were other like abusive tendencies and issues within their relationship as well. There's a big age gap. There's a lot of sketch stuff in this relationship, but anyway, she finds out years later and actually leaves her husband and escapes from China to New York to go track down her daughter. And this is where our story really is, and there's a few other components. Like, she had this childhood best friend who she sort of had a relationship with. In a way, it was like mostly platonic, but could have been more, and she tracks him down as well. His name is Anthony, and there are a bunch of other layers. She also, oh my gosh, this scratch. I was out to dinner with my family, and I went to sit down in a chair, and the chair had been moved, and I fell in front of like an entire restaurant, literally like butt on the floor. Thank goodness I'm okay, my baby was okay, but I was holding my baby too. Anyway, and I got this like a really nasty cut. Anyway, she like goes to New York and tracks him down as well, and the way she gets out of China and gets to New York anyway is through like this really shady system, these really shady people, like black market dealers, I guess. I don't know exactly what they're called, but she also ends up working at an adult club of sorts to help save more money up to pay these people back. and also to make a fund to probably eventually run away with her daughter. A lot more happens after this, obviously, that, like I said, I don't really want to spoil. Unless anyone's looking for an actual like synopsis of this story, then you can absolutely like message me and I can give you like the added synopsis. But that's just basically what happens, and I'm just gonna move right on to my review. So for this review, like I said, I'm gonna try and keep it entirely spoiler free. If I do mention something relating to the ending, I'm gonna give a huge warning, but I don't think that's gonna happen. I think probably one of the biggest things that I thought when I started reading this and kept thinking for a lot of the book was that it just brings up a lot of questions about adoption, especially overseas adoption, and the feelings and just the experiences of all of the parties involved. The children, the biological parents, the adopted parents. It's just a really interesting look into this, but obviously it's not like a true story. It's not a typical experience, but it does show firsthand in a way how horrific the one-child policy really was in China for a long time. And while in some ways it helped reduce a lot of poverty for the children and the families and the people who did exist, the reality is that limiting the amount of children people can have is just going to result in horrible things happening. Obviously tons of like adoptions, legal and otherwise, but like there were a lot of other terrible things that happened, like forced sterilization and just horrible things. So it's just an interesting look at that. But the outcome of a lot of the one-child policy is that now there's a hugely declining birth rate. But you know, there were some good things that came out of it too. Like I said, huge poverty reduction. There was a lot. So it's a complicated issue, but it's interesting to see it explored through a fictitious narrative like this, but it felt very visceral. It felt like an interesting way to explore this. And I also really like how we got point of view chapters of both women. So kind of going back to just the adoption thing in general, we're getting the point of view of this biological mother who, it should be noted though, did not consent to giving up her baby and did not want to give up her baby. So that's obviously a hugely different perspective than a mother who maybe couldn't take care of her baby or this or that and like did want to give up her baby or felt she had to. So noting that obviously that's really different. But it was really interesting to get the point of view chapters for both women, and the story does feel, I feel like, a little bit more ultimately like Jasmine's story, but I like that we got both views and backstory on Rebecca as well, and Rebecca's upbringing and her family and even her relationship with her dad, which it was pretty relevant, I think, in her life and her influence. Not only was it just interesting to explore the story this way, it created this really sharp juxtaposition between the views of these women and how these women experienced life. And this is kind of something that a little bit further in the story, Rebecca kind of admits that she probably has a lot of biases that blinded her to certain things. And so it's just really interesting that they provided these views, and I feel like nobody was shamed. There was no like Jasmine was the good character and Rebecca was the bad character or vice versa. They were just both human women. They both loved this girl. They both views were provided. It was just an interesting take on this whole story and this whole experience. Now, the actual plot itself felt so unique, and I felt like it was a really great vehicle to explore topics like privilege, race, even like language and language biases that we have, sexism. Actually, specifically with Rebecca's character, I think through the lens of parenting, it was interesting seeing like a working mother, and she even touches on this, that she can basically, her husband can do what would be the bare minimum or considered a really regular thing to do and will be applauded for it, versus like she's constantly like question why you weren't there for your child's this or that. But like her husband, nobody's ever like, why weren't you at that dance recital, or why weren't you at this thing? That's a really real thing that exists. Well, I think that it's getting probably a little bit better. That's a real thing that exists, and I'm not a working mom, so I can't really explore that. I stay home with my kids, so it makes sense that obviously everyone would expect me to be at certain things. But I think if both parents are working parents, it is really, really weird that the expectation is still, I think, for the mom to be there at all of these things, versus if the dad shows up, he's like a hero, he's applauded, he's such a great dad. He may be all of those things, But if you're sharing that division of labor in that way, then it really shouldn't be that way. So that's kind of an interesting little thing that's explored. But like I said, while these things are touched on, none of these topics are by any means the centerpiece of the story. None of these are drilled into your head or non-stop brought up. They are just touched on just enough and woven into the plot in a very natural and very relaxed way. But they're there absolutely enough for, say, a book club to have a great time discussing them. This would be a really good book club choice. This would be a really fun book to do a companion read with. I almost wish I could have done that, but like with kids and everything, it's just hard to know when I'm gonna get through a book. But this would be a really fun one to do a companion read and discussion with, and I would love to, of course, if people have comments to leave below discussing this, I would be intrigued. Because like I said, these topics were brought up and they were kind of interwoven in the plot in what felt like a very natural way, especially with, I think, this particular plot line. So I just loved that. I really appreciated that. Something I could have generally kind of done without, honestly, was all of the emphasis on the relationship with Anthony. I guess it was sweet. I guess it was nice that she reconnected with this childhood friend and all of those feelings. I felt like I could take it or leave it with that personally. There was enough interesting stuff going on in the rest of the plot line. The stuff with Anthony, personally, didn't care for it much, didn't care about it much. It was there, it was fine. But I really thought that the husband, the adopted father, that husband, Brandon, that was, like, I kept going back and forth on that character. The way that the tension was kind of built, especially between Brandon and his wife Rebecca. And overall, I just felt like it was pretty good. Like, it ended the way I would have probably liked it to end. I don't know. The ending, I don't think I'll really talk about, but yeah, overall, I felt like it was such a unique story. She definitely had a way with her words of, like, she would use these great descriptors that kind of made you feel a little bit what the characters were feeling. There was a lot of, the anger was bubbling up. It was like just, and things that seem like obvious language to use surrounding those emotions, but were just really used in a great way. And so I feel like the writing itself had a nice prose to it. I overall really enjoyed this book. There were a couple parts I could have done without, but I thought it was such a unique premise and it definitely lived up to my expectations and I enjoyed it. And I want to hear from anybody who is interested in reading it or has read it. Like, if you've read it, what were your thoughts? Do you agree with me in that this was a great way to touch on certain themes? It was a really interesting way to explore adoption, China's one-child policy. I watched a documentary on China's one-child policy a little while ago, and so this just really also was interesting. I'm gonna see if I can find a link to that documentary, but yeah, I just would love to like kind of chat with people about this. Some of these topics can be a little bit like heavier, triggering depending on where you are in your life, but the way she handles them is like there's no unnecessary like descriptions or anything like that in my opinion. So I felt like it was handled really well. That's gonna be it for this summary and review. Would definitely recommend this. I'm gonna try and update my Goodreads too and add something to that as well with this, but that's gonna be it for this video. Like, subscribe, all that good stuff, and thank you so much for watching. I will see you later.